All right, part 4 of the harmony of the Gospels. And so we're picking up, remember, last time we saw the baptism and the temptation. And so we're picking up with the actual beginning of Jesus' official ministry here. So we saw, he appeared with John the Baptist, he was announced by him, he was baptized, and we talked about the parallels of the 40 days in the wilderness being tempted, paralleled the 40 years of the nation. And so he basically did it right, is the idea. Now, we don't know for sure which wilderness he went to. He could have crossed over the Jordan and kept going east because there's lots of wilderness that way. He could have just headed south because there's even more wilderness that way. There's a lot to choose from. So consensus is that he went to the Judean wilderness, which is to the south. So we're not 100% sure, but probably. So he returns after all these temptations. Actually, the last one of the temptations was him being on the pinnacle of the temple. So that obviously happened after he returned. So the question is, like, depending on which wilderness he went to, what route back, did he go there and then come back or whatever? But he basically, he returns from the wilderness, starts gathering his disciples, and the Gospel of John gives us a whole bunch of details about this time period, we think, because remember, it's not strictly chronological in John's Gospel. But none of the other Gospels even mention these incidents. But he describes a lot of things that happened. He mentions things like the first cleansing of the temple, that probably happened along this period of time. The wedding in Cana, which was actually in Galilee, so that's around this time, but not yet. You'll see what I mean. He has his interaction with Nicodemus, you know, John 3, being born again and all that. That happened during this time. But those are only mentioned by John. So probably sometime after all of that, we come to Jesus returning to Galilee, and that's our first topic of this week. So what led Jesus to go back to Galilee? It could have been a couple of things. We're not really sure. The thing, according to Matthew and Mark, seems to be the arrest of John the Baptist. And we get that. Matthew, by the way, is the most terse on this topic, as you can see in your handout, of all the gospel writers. He just says in 4:12, now when Jesus heard that John had been taken into custody, he withdrew into Galilee. And that's it. That's all Matthew tells us. I will remind you again, last week I mentioned that John had been baptizing for about 6 months before Jesus showed up, and that he had about 6 months more before he was arrested. So you subtract the 40 days in the wilderness, they're side by side, or not side by side, but in the same region in Judea, both ministering for a little less than 5 months, right? And then when John gets taken into custody is when Jesus, beats feet, goes back up to Galilee. It could just be a coincidence, it's not causation, right? So that happened, and then this happened. We don't know that that's the reason he went. Mark tells us, like Matthew, that after the arrest of John the Baptist, it says in 1:14, now after John had been taken into custody, Jesus came into Galilee preaching the gospel of God. Again, they happened at the same time. We don't know what was the cause. So Matthew and Mark mention that John was arrested. Luke says in 4:14, and Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit. No mention about John, nothing. So might have been John's arrest, might have been coincidence. But John gives us a different reason, and it implies that it may be the reason. He says in John 4:1, therefore, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, and then in verse 2 he says, Jesus didn't do the baptizing, the disciples did. In verse 3, he left Judea and went away again into Galilee. That seems to be implying that Jesus went to Galilee when he attracted the attention of the Pharisees. Now, does it matter? I don't know. But I thought about this. If John is arrested, and we know that John had a few words with the Pharisees, called them a brood of vipers, that they're going to burn in hell. that he probably got all their attention, and when he was arrested, now who did they turn their attention to but Jesus? That's what I think might have happened. And so you put those together, that's a possibility. But either way, it has the appearance, though, of Jesus running away scared. Now, he may actually be running away, definitely not scared, but he probably knows there's going to be a lot of problems with these boys, and there's no use in getting into it too early because he's got things to do, right? So, although Matthew says in 4:12, he withdrew into Galilee, so it does sound like he's avoiding them. So that's a possibility. Now, I will point out that John's gospel actually tells us that Jesus intended to go to Galilee. A few chapters before, it tells us that he left. In 1:43, it says, the next day he purposed to go into Galilee, and he found Philip, and Jesus said to him, follow me. And it wasn't until chapter 4 that John tells us he actually left and went to Galilee. So he's gathering disciples before he goes. And John also tells us in chapter 4, by the way, about the Samaritan woman. That happened on the way, because remember, it's Judea, Samaria, and then Galilee up top. So you have to go through there. What's one interesting thing is there are some scholars that suggest that some Jews would not travel through Samaria. They would actually cross the Jordan, go north past Samaria, and then cross back over into Galilee, if that's where they were headed. They dislike the Samaritans so much. I don't know. Sounds a bit extreme to me, but you never know. Whether it's true or not, Jesus didn't do that. He went right through Samaria. And so, because he had an appointment to keep with a young lady at a well. Now, what did Jesus do when he got back to Galilee? Well, he started gathering disciples, and he preached and he taught. And Luke gives us, by the way, an example of one of those sermons in Luke 4:16. This is not the only sermon, not the first sermon. This is an example sermon. He says, and he came to Nazareth where he had been brought up, and as was his custom, he entered the synagogue on the Sabbath and stood up to read. So as was his custom. And the book of the prophet of Isaiah was handed to him. He opened the book and found the place where it was written, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord. He closed the book and gave it back to the attendant, sat down, and the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. He began to say to them, today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. Do you remember last week I mentioned that when Satan was quoting the Old Testament back to Jesus in the temptation, that he stopped one verse short of that gangster verse? Well, Jesus here stopped not one verse short, he stopped in the middle of a verse. Now, to be fair, they didn't have versification back then, so that's just where they stopped. This is from Isaiah 61. And also, to be fair, the synagogues had a schedule of readings that they went through week to week, and so this is just what was on the schedule. He didn't choose it. This is what, he's God. Maybe he did choose it, but you know what I mean. This just happened to be on the schedule. The actual full passage from Isaiah 61, let me read this, and you'll see where he stopped. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring the good news to the afflicted. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to captives and freedom to prisoners, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord, and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort those who mourn, to grant, and it goes on. Oh, and what was that about? Vengeance? No, that's his second coming. See what he did there? Because it stopped right there, Jesus was able to say, this has been fulfilled in your hearing. If he had kept going, it wouldn't have been fulfilled yet. That's his next coming. I just find that interesting. And of course, it perfectly described what Jesus was actually doing. And early on, he was, in Luke 4:15, praised by all. That's so nice when that happens. Afterwards, not so much. And Luke tells us that when he actually started to tell them the truth and things about the truth and stuff like that, they tried to kill him. But let's move on to the next topic. I'm going to wrap all these topics up at the end. So next thing we see is fishers of men. So there's an inner circle of Jesus' ministry. He has these 4 disciples that are, and they were 2 sets of brothers, Andrew and Peter, and James and John. So these 4 were kind of his inner circle. And by the way, all of them were called at the same time. I don't know if you realize that. And none of them were the first disciples called. There were others disciples. But these 4 were all called together, and they all became the closest ones to him. Now, if you read Matthew and Mark's account of them getting called and just go by their accounts, it sounds absolutely crazy. According to Matthew, Jesus was just walking along the Sea of Galilee one day, and he comes across 2 brothers, Peter and Andrew. They're fishermen, and Jesus says in 4:19, "Follow me, I will make you fishers of men." And see what he did there? Because they're fishers? Okay. Then Matthew says in 4:20, immediately they left their nets and followed him. And Mark's account is almost word for word identical to that. If all you had to go by was Matthew and Mark, this would make absolutely no sense. They just walked away from everything and left their careers behind, and James and John left their father behind. Bye, Dad, we're going with this guy. Just met him. That sounds insane. And that's not actually what happened. And then he keeps going, and you see 2 more brothers, and he on a boat, and he says the same thing, and they follow him same way. That'd be crazy. Well, but if you read the Gospels, the other Gospels, you get way more detail. What if I told you that Jesus had met Peter and Andrew already way back in Judea before they went to Galilee? That actually happened. What if I told you there were a lot of interactions between Jesus and Andrew and Peter before any of this happened? It would actually make a lot more sense if I told you that, wouldn't it? In John 1, we're told that 2 of John the Baptist's disciples began to follow Jesus around. And one of them was Andrew, Peter's brother. So yes, Andrew was actually a disciple of John the Baptist, which is interesting. And so Andrew goes to Peter and says, when he meets, he sees Jesus, and tells him, I think we found the Messiah. And then they start following him. And all this happened before Jesus called them in Galilee. This is much earlier. Now, it was likely, according to the text, everybody was in Judea because of a feast. So everybody has to go, all the men have to go to Jerusalem for 3 feasts a year, and this was probably one of them. So if you go back to John 1 and read the account, John 1:35, it says, again the next day John was standing with 2 of his disciples, this is John the Baptist, 2 of his disciples, and he looked at Jesus as he walked and said, behold the Lamb of God. This is actually the second time he said it. The first time was when Jesus came to be baptized. This is the next day. And so he sees Jesus again and he says this, behold the Lamb of God. And the 2 disciples heard him speak, and they followed Jesus. And Jesus turned around and saw them following and said to them, what do you seek? They said to him, Rabbi, which translated means teacher, where are you staying? He said to them, come and you will see. And they came and saw where he was staying, and they stayed with him that day, for it was about the 10th hour. One of the 2 who heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first found his own brother Simon and said to him, we have found the Messiah, which translated means Christ. And he brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, you are Simon, the son of John. You shall be called Cephas, which translated is Peter. Now, to be clear, Jesus didn't call them to be disciples at this point. He just met them, and he's interacting with them. He's talking to them. The very next verse, he calls Philip to follow him, and then they called Nathanael after that. But not Andrew or Peter yet. Right? That doesn't happen until where we are now in Galilee. So they met. They interacted. But there's even more. If you look at Luke's account, Luke gives a whole new spin on Jesus walking on the beach. And there's way more to it than he just walked up to them and said, follow me. First, Jesus asked to use Peter's boat in 5:2. This is in Luke 5:2. It says, and he saw 2 boats lying at the edge of the lake, but the fishermen had gotten out of them and were washing their nets. Now, if you pause here, you can see a possible contradiction with Matthew and Mark. They said that Peter and Andrew were casting their nets into the sea, and this here says that they were cleaning their nets, washing their nets. But if you keep reading in verse 3, it says, "And he got into one of the boats which was Simon's, and asked him to put out a little way from land. He sat down and began to teach the people from the boat." Now, I didn't read it, but back in verse 1, the crowds were gathering around, and so this is a great solution. You get in the boat, that's your rostrum from which to speak. How often do you get to use the word rostrum? And, well, not never for me. And so after he's done, he tells Peter to go out to this deep water and put down the nets. And so they're casting their nets. So you see, it's not a contradiction. What about James and John? Okay, we don't have an account of them interacting directly with Jesus up until this point, but they very clearly knew him, all about him. Well, they just sat on the beach and heard a sermon by him, so there you go. But Luke writes in 9 and 10, 5, 9, and 10, "For amazement had seized him and all his companions because of the catch of fish which they had taken." In verse 10, "And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon." Well, that makes a whole lot more sense now. They were business partners. But you can bet Andrew and Peter, after meeting someone in Judea that they were convinced was the Messiah, they would have mentioned it to their business partners when they got back, right? James and John. Plus, Jesus just got done preaching a sermon from Peter's boat that they heard right there in front of them. And so they weren't ignorant to who Jesus was and what he taught. So it wasn't the first time they'd heard of him or heard him. So what looks crazy in Matthew and Mark starts to make a whole lot more sense if you read John and Luke, right? By the way, I skipped right over a great interaction in the boat with Peter and Jesus. When Jesus told him to put out to deep water and let down the nets, it says this in verse 6 to 8. It says, "When they had done this, they enclosed a great quantity of fish. Their nets began to break. They signaled their partners in the other boat, which are James and John, to come and help them. They came and filled both of the boats so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw that, he fell down at Jesus' feet, saying, 'Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man, O Lord.'" So to recap, Peter heard from his brother that this was the Messiah. Peter followed him around in Judea. Peter gets a literal front row seat to his sermon in Galilee. Peter sees an incredible miracle, and then Jesus says, "Follow me, and I'll make you fishers of men." So what started off looking like it would be a crazy thing for them to do, now it's looking like it would be crazy for him not to follow him, right? And he did. But also notice that Jesus wasn't changing their vocations, he was redirecting it, right? We don't know if Peter and Andrew's father was a fisherman, but James and John's father was a fisherman. Zebedee is right there with them. But it's likely this was all they knew, this was all they did. Also, it is all they would be doing for the rest of their lives, just redirected, catching men. And that brings me up to the next one, the demoniac healed on the Sabbath. Like I said, I'm going to tie all these together really quick for you at the end. I think you'll like it. So Mark and Luke both give us accounts of what happened at yet another synagogue in Capernaum. Capernaum, by the way, is I think it's the biggest town, if not one of the bigger towns on the Sea of Galilee. It's where Jesus really centers his ministry from. And his mode of teaching was apparently not what people were used to. You need to know that rabbis hardly ever make categorical statements. They just don't do it. It's like it's against their religion or something. They still don't, even to this day. If you, I can think of a couple of movies where there were scenes with rabbis getting asked questions, and they'll always have something to say like, well, some say it's this and some say it's that, and they'll never give you a straight answer. Father of the Bride, the one with Steve Martin, comes to mind. Great scene with the rabbi there. And it does exactly that. That's how the rabbis do. So Jesus shows up and just starts teaching, well, this is the way things are. He doesn't quote any other rabbis that we know of. He's not appealing to some tradition. He just reads the scripture and says, and this is true, and it's true because this, that, and the other thing. Or he even adds to it. Rabbis will never do that. He adds to it. You've heard it said, blah, 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 but I say to you, and he adds to it. They were not used to that kind of teaching because they were used to a lot of, well, I don't know. Some say this, some say that. I mean, look at how many times I say I don't know, right? It's like, I know it's a lot. And the absurdity of it does not escape me. I know, here I am supposed to be the teacher, and my catchphrase is probably, I don't know. But I'm not going to make something up, so. But Mark tells us in 122, they were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority and not as the scribes. You might wonder to yourself, how did they know that what he was saying was right if he was teaching with authority? Because when you teach with authority, you better actually have authority, right? Well, wouldn't you know it, but a situation immediately presents itself. Mark continues, verse 23. Just then there was a man in their synagogue with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, saying, "What business do we have with each other, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be quiet and come out of him." Throwing him into convulsions, the unclean spirit cried out with a loud voice and came out of him. They were all amazed, so that they debated among themselves, saying, "What is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." So he teaches with authority, and then the situation presents itself just custom made for him to demonstrate his authority. And even more than casting out the unclean spirit is, which is a demonstration of that authority, there's the testimony of the demon itself, right? Verse 24, "Have you come to destroy us?" Well, that's authority to punish and condemn. And then in verse 24 he says, "And I know who you are, the Holy Son of God." That's the authority of God himself. That's not normal authority, right? That's for real authority. So the people coming out of the synagogue, how do they summarize the synagogue that day? It says in verse 27, "What is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." And they do. By the way, does that phrase sound familiar from anywhere else in the New Testament? It's almost exactly the same thing that the disciples said to Jesus when he calmed the storm. Right? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey. He commands even the wind and the seas obey him. Remember that? That's authority. Here's a couple other verses on Jesus' authority, by the way. Matthew 28:18, "And Jesus came up and spoke to them, saying, 'All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth.'" Authority. Colossians 2:10, "In him you have been made complete. He is the head over all rule and authority." That's Highlander rules, right? Highlander rules, there can only be one. Great movie. John 3:35, "The Father loves the Son and has given all things into his hand." All things into his hand. 1 Peter 3:22, "Who is at the right hand of God, having gone into heaven, after angels and authorities and powers had been subjected to him." That's authority. John 19:11, Jesus answered, "You would have no authority," this is to the people arresting him, "You would have no authority over me unless it had been given to you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin." So, authority. And by the way, in the synagogue that day, that was their teacher that day. And so, yeah, he wasn't necessarily purposefully teaching with authority. He was just teaching, because it was the living word expounding the written word. And why shouldn't he say it with authority? Because they were his words, right? More than that, they were him. So of course it had the ring of authority to it. All right, next thing we see, Peter's mother-in-law healed. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke all give this account of Jesus healing Peter's mother-in-law. And this is probably shocking news to some of you, but this means something extraordinary. Peter had a mother-in-law. And a mother-in-law is, by definition, the mother of your spouse. So ergo, in like manner, we can conclude Peter had a wife. Never met her. Sorry, Catholics, but it's true. They know it's true. Anyway, even Paul mentioned it in 1 Corinthians 9:5. Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, even as the rest of the apostles and the brothers of the Lord, and Cephas, who's Peter? So Peter was married. Peter had a home. According to Mark 1:29, he shared this home with his brother Andrew, and also, apparently, his mother-in-law. I wonder how Peter really felt about that. I also wonder how Andrew felt about that. Did you think of that? I know you got to live with your mother-in-law, but do I have to live with your mother? No, I don't. By the way, as we're attempting to work through this chronologically, like I said, sometimes it's difficult to place things. This may be the first healing of an individual that we see. Except for the demoniac, I'm making a distinction between casting out demons and healing illnesses and sicknesses and whatnot. It's possible that John's account of the healing of the nobleman's son was around this time. We don't know exactly which one came first, but only John mentions that, and he's not chronological. So we'll take this one. But we hear Jesus was healing people, but we haven't seen an individual healing done yet. And like I said, I'm making a distinction between casting out a demon and healing someone who's sick. But now we've seen one of each, so that's cool. Interesting that the mother-in-law was healed so completely that she jumps up and starts serving them. Now, while we've been talking about authority, there's one of these accounts that includes a little tidbit that the others don't have. In Luke 4:39, here's how Jesus healed her. It says, and standing over her, he rebuked the fever, and it left her. Right? So he rebuked the fever. And so, I know this is an abrupt ending to the lesson. Like I said, we're done early, because y'all didn't interrupt me. And I planned for that. So, just saying. But that leads straight into our takeaway for all of this. The demons obeyed him. The wind and the waves obeyed him. The fever obeys him. Andrew and Peter obeyed him. James and John obeyed him. Even Philip and Nathaniel obeyed him, right? He has authority over all these things. They all obeyed him. And so our takeaway from this week is it begs the question that we need to ask ourselves, do I obey him? Oh, dang it. Quit teaching and started meddling. That simple, single, solitary question is our takeaway for this week. Do I obey him?